All right, hey everyone, fellow UPSC aspirants out there, you got to keep up with current events, right? And today, well, let's just say today's deep dive is especially relevant.
Definitely is.
We're going to be talking about something that the Indian government's really grappling with. How to regulate digital content. All that stuff that you're probably using right now to prep. I'm talking OTT platforms, YouTube, social media.
It's everywhere, yeah.
And get this, the government is actually looking at putting some new legal frameworks in place.
Oh, wow.
So this isn't just some theoretical debate, folks. This could actually directly impact the digital world that we're all living in right now.
Big time.
So we're diving deep today, taking a look at recent reports from the Hindu and Indian Express. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on a report titled India, Regulating Digital Content, Laws, Challenges, and Responses. But before we jump into all of that, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think it's important to kind of set the stage here.
Okay, yeah.
And, there's no better way to do that than to talk about the elephant in the room. Or maybe we should say the controversial figure that's all over everybody's feed. We got to talk about Ranveer Labad.
Of course, yeah.
So, as you all probably know, the Supreme Court recently granted him protection for arrest, but at the same time, they really criticized his comments.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
It really kind of shows you the kind of tightrope walk that India is trying to do right now.
Yeah.
They're trying to find that balance between free speech and responsible content. And in Veer's case, it's right there in the spotlight.
Absolutely. It's like the court is saying, look, we're all for freedom of speech, but hold on, there are limits, and you, my friend, you've crossed them.
Yeah, it was a pretty strong message.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that it feels like Ranveer's case has actually become a catalyst. Like it's pushed this whole debate about regulating digital content to the forefront. What do you think?
Oh, totally. It's like a microcosm of all the anxieties that people have about what's going on in the digital space in India.
Yeah.
It's not just about Ranveer. It's brought up all these issues, all these concerns that are making people really want stricter regulation.
Okay, so let's talk about those concerns. What are the things that are making people really sit up and take notice? What's making the lawmakers, the courts, even everyday citizens, what's got them worried?
Well, there are a few things. You've got the violent content, the obscene content, the misinformation, the hate speech. It's a lot. And then there's the whole issue of whether these platforms are being used for stuff that's just bad for us, for individuals, and for society as a whole.
And it's not just the public or, like the media that's talking about this, right?
Right.
I mean, we're seeing the Supreme Court, high courts, MPs, even groups like the National Commission for Women, they're all saying, hey, this is a problem and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like everyone's on the same page. They're saying we need to do something about this. And when you've got all these different voices, all these sectors saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, that means that there's a sense of urgency to really tackle this problem.
So for all of you UPSC folks out there listening in, burning the midnight oil, here's what you need to remember. This matters.
Big time.
This isn't just some sideshow.
Right.
You need to understand these concerns, the why behind them, the motivations. It's classic UPSC stuff, right?
Absolutely.
You got to be able to analyze the government's actions. You got to be able to predict how policy might change.
You can't just memorize headlines. You got to understand the how and the why of governments.
So, okay, we've talked about how there's this push for regulation. But India's not starting from zero here, right? I mean, there are already laws on the books. It's a bit of a maze, maybe, but it's there.
True. We've got the IT Act from back in 2000, the Indecent Representation of Women Act, and the TIE-CSO Act to protect children. But the tricky part, adapting these laws to the digital age.
Yeah, I mean, these laws were written before smartphones even existed, before social media and OTT platforms.
Right. It's like trying to fix a modern computer with a screwdriver from the 1950s.
Right.
It doesn't quite work.
And then you throw the IT rules of 2021 into the mix. They were supposed to target social media and online content specifically, but even those are getting challenged in court.
Yeah, that's right. The 2021 IT rules, those intermediary guidelines, they've been super controversial. We've seen multiple high courts like Bombay and Madras putting a hold on some parts of them. It really shows you how complicated this whole thing is.
Yeah, it's like a legal tug of war. The government's pushing for regulation, but the courts are making sure they don't go too far, that they don't step on our fundamental rights.
Exactly. And in the middle of all this, you've got the INB Ministry, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. They're responsible for regulating media and entertainment content. And they're not just sitting back, they're stepping in with new directives.
What kind of directives?
Well, they're basically telling social media and OTT platforms to stick to the code of ethics, the one that's already there. And they're saying they need to implement stricter controls on adult content. Things like age verification, flagging inappropriate content, and actually taking it down.
So the government's got a lot of tools in their toolbox here. Existing laws, new rules, directives to different platforms. They're really trying to get a handle on this whole digital content landscape.
Yeah, and it shows that they're serious about it. They're being proactive. We've got the Standing Committee on Communications and Information Technology looking into amending the laws, and the Ministry of Electronics and IT is checking if the current laws are even working. It's a very dynamic situation.
So we've got the laws, the rules, the directives. The big question now is it actually working?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into right after this. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this deep dive. Welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about how India is kind of trying to figure out this whole digital content regulation thing, right? We talked about those existing laws and those new IT rules and even those directives from the INB ministry.
Right, and we can't forget about those high court rulings. Either they really put a stop to some parts of those new rules, it just shows you this whole thing is far from settled.
Exactly. It really is. The legal side of things is always changing. So for you UPSC folks out there, it's more important now than ever to stay in the loop and really understand all the sides of this whole debate.
Okay, so we've got this kind of multi-layered approach to regulating digital content. But it seems like one of the biggest problems is that there isn't a clear set of rules specifically for today's digital world.
You got it. Trying to control these ever-changing digital platforms with rules meant for traditional media, it's just not going to cut it. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
So what we really need is a more focused approach, something that takes into account all the unique challenges of the digital world, right?
Absolutely. We need rules that clearly define what's harmful in the digital world, rules that outline the responsibility of those platforms, and we need a good way to handle complaints, a system that works and that acknowledges the special nature of platforms like YouTube and social media, where most of the content comes from users.
And speaking of YouTube, that brings us to that three-tier system for dealing with complaints under the IT rules of 2021. Can you break that down for us? I think a lot of UPSC aspirants might find it a bit confusing.
Yeah, no problem. It's basically a system for handling complaints about online content. The first level is self-regulation by the platform themselves. Each platform is supposed to have its own way of dealing with user complaints and taking down content that violates their rules.
So let's say someone sees something offensive on YouTube, they would report it to YouTube directly.
That's right. And then YouTube would check out the content and decide what to do. Maybe they take it down, maybe they warn the person who uploaded it, or maybe they even suspend the account.
But what if the platform doesn't do anything or the user isn't happy with what they do?
Well, that's where the second level comes in. It's called industry self-regulation. This means there's a group that oversees all the platforms in a particular industry, like social media or OTT platforms. So if a user feels like their complaint wasn't handled properly by the platform, they can take it to this industry group.
So it's like having a higher authority to go to, which makes the whole industry more accountable.
Exactly. And then we come to the third level, government oversight. If both the platform and the industry group fail to deal with the complaint in a satisfactory way, then the government steps in.
So the government is like the final judge, the last line of defense against bad content. But even this system, with all its levels, has hit some roadblocks, right?
Oh yeah, definitely the implementation of this three-tail system has been met with a lot of skepticism and legal challenges. Several high courts have raised concerns about how effective it is and whether it could be misused, especially when it comes to the government's role in that third tier.
I can see why that would be a concern. Giving the government the final say raises questions about censorship and whether it infringes on freedom of expression.
You're absolutely right. The main challenge here is finding that balance between preventing harm and protecting people's fundamental rights, and that's why there's so much debate and legal action around this whole issue.
It really seems like the courts are playing a huge role in shaping how these regulations will actually work in the end.
Absolutely, they are. The courts are acting like guardians, protecting our basic rights, and they're scrutinizing these regulations very closely to make sure they don't cross any constitutional lines. The legal battles that are happening right now are really shaping the future of digital content regulation in India. And for all you UPSC aspirants out there, it's super important to understand all these details and all the arguments from both sides.
This whole situation with YouTube and the three-tier system really shows just how hard it is to regulate platforms that rely so heavily on user-generated content.
It's a tough one. It's almost like trying to regulate a public park. The government can set some general rules, but they can't really control every single conversation that happens there.
But at the same time, platforms like YouTube have a responsibility to make sure that their platform isn't being used to spread hate speech or lies or incite violence.
It's a delicate balancing act. On one hand, you want to allow people to express themselves freely and have open discussions, but on the other hand, you have to prevent your platform from becoming a tool for harm.
So how do we find that balance? What are some of the ways forward? What can we do?
Well, like we've been talking about, we need clearer laws, specifically for the digital age, that would get rid of the confusion and give us a stronger foundation for regulation. But just having laws isn't enough. We need a multifaceted approach that includes not just the government and the platforms, but also groups from civil society advocacy groups and even the users themselves.
So basically a more collaborative approach where everyone gets a say.
Exactly. We need open discussions, strong debates, and a willingness to listen to each other. That's how we'll find solutions that both work and respect everyone's rights.
And this collaborative approach needs to consider the economic side of things too, right? I mean, India's digital economy is booming, and these platforms are a big part of that growth.
That's right. Any regulations that are put in place need to be carefully designed so that they don't stifle innovation or stop this important sector from growing. It's a complex equation with lots of factors to consider.
So for our UPSC listeners, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
I'd say the most important thing to remember is that this is an evolving situation. The laws are being challenged, the courts are making decisions, and the debate is far from over. So stay informed, keep up with the latest developments, and be prepared to adjust your understanding as things change. This is all about showing that you understand current affairs, which is a huge part of doing well in the UPSC.
All right, and we're back. So we've really gone deep on this whole digital content regulation thing in India, haven't we?
Yeah, I've covered a lot of ground. Legal stuff, those grievance mechanisms, the whole balancing act between freedom of expression and, keeping contents responsible. It's a lot.
It is. It's complicated. But as we wrap things up, I want to make sure that our listeners, especially those UPSC folks who are studying hard, I want to make sure they're walking away with some key takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's boil it all down.
Okay, so takeaway number one, and this is important. This whole thing, it's not static. It's constantly changing. Laws are being challenged. Courts are making decisions. The government is, well, they're adapting their approach, trying to keep up. So staying up to date isn't just like a good idea.
It's essential.
It's essential, especially if you really want to understand how this is all playing out.
Absolutely. Don't just rely on stuff you read months ago. Keep an eye on those headlines, follow what's happening in the courts, and be ready to kind of shift your understanding as the things develop. That's what shows you're really on top of current events. And for UPSC, that's huge.
Takeaway number two, there are no easy answers here. It's a complex issue, and there are good arguments on both sides of the debate. And those UPSC examiners, they love to see that you get that.
Exactly. Don't fall into that trap of thinking it's black and white, oversimplifying everything. Embrace the complexity.
Right.
Explore the different points of view. Show them that you can think critically. It's not about memorizing facts. It's about showing you can analyze and deal with these really complex problems.
And finally, takeaway number three, connect the dots. This topic, it doesn't fit neatly into one little box on your syllabus.
Nope.
It's about governance, social justice, tech, the economy, freedom of speech. It's all connected. So make those connections.
Right. Build those bridges. See how the different concepts relate to each other. That's what makes a good UPSC aspirant stand out.
All right, before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought, something to think about as you're studying. We've talked a lot about the legal and ethical stuff.
Yeah.
But what about the economic side of all of this? How do you think these new developments could impact India's digital economy? That economy is growing like crazy, and those platforms we've been talking about, they're a big part of that growth.
It's a great question, and it's one that policymakers are really struggling with. How do you create a system that encourages innovation and investment, lets that digital economy thrive, but at the same time, make sure that the content is responsible and protects users from harm?
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is.
And hey, it's the kind of question that could be a great UPSC essay topic or spark a really interesting discussion in an interview. So to all you UPSC aspirants out there, go check out those reports we talked about in the Hindu and Indian Express. Dig a little deeper. Form your own opinions.
Yeah.
And hey, if you've got any questions or thoughts or even just insights you want to share, leave us a comment below. We always love hearing from you guys.
Absolutely. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. We'll keep bringing you the most relevant and fascinating topics for your UPSC journey.
Until next time, everyone, happy studying and best of luck with your preparations.